What effect do you think that Hollywood movies have on things like world consciousness or just the psyche of the civilizations that it hit?
Well, I think movies in general, and storytelling in general is the central human communication for millennia, right? So cavemen sat around and the campfire and told stories. So the structure of a story to illustrate the do's and don'ts of human existence, I think is it's basic to human interaction. Let me tell you a story. Is everyone leans into that, and it wakes up that part of you that wants to know how you can live better, how you can improve your life. So there's a connection between storytelling and the innate desire to improve your life. So I think that at its best, Hollywood films tend to slant towards what they would say the Hollywood ending or the happy ending. They tend to slant toward the positive view of human possibilities. So I think that there's a huge responsibility. And going back to one of Michael's first questions, what is this story about? Right. So when I ask the first question with everything, what is this story about? The answer has to be the thing that is the human service. What part of this that we're doing is the human service that is our beliefs, and we can disagree and we can debate and we can argue, and the movie can do that, but we can't even get started until we have something that we want to say, until we have an opinion. And Suicide Squad, for example, the question it poses is, can bad people do good things? Right? Is there a point where you've done so many bad things that nothing you do can be redemptive? And that's a really profound, beautiful question that I love, is the central question of a big, summer Hollywood blockbuster.
Hi, South by Southwester. I'm Laurie Clark, and I'd like to propose a panel on why story is such an effective tool for creating real change in the world. The offering is based on a 9-month project in which we interviewed over 40 experts, from showmakers to professional screenwriters, peacekeepers on nation building, developmental psychologists and cultural historians. We interviewed people who are using script writing to change the lives of young offenders, change makers who are making life safer for women in India and around the world. We even interviewed successful indie authors and a few philosophers. This project came about as a result of a comment made by one of our proposed panelists in the mythology class in one of our recent projects. Check it out. Maria's asking, please talk more about our need to have new myths and why they are so important.
Oh, okay. Well, going back to the definition that myths are the stories we tell ourselves to explain the world around us and within us. The world is changing so much, and we don't have good stories to help us figure out how to navigate some of these changes that happen all the time. I mean, I'd like a good myth about the Windows updates. I mean, seriously, what's going on here? Right?
This would be a dystopian myth, right?
Totally dystopian, very frustrating. It's like Sisyphus pushing that rock up the hill. You get there and it's like, what?
Having your liver eaten out every 5 minutes.
Exactly. Oh, it's wretched. Maybe it's a cartoon series. But again, let's remind ourselves that every person, every family, every town, every sports team, every country, every religion has a mythology. As in, they have a story they tell to explain themselves. They have a front they put up to the world. They have hidden, usually, the foibles. Think about a friend of mine and my fellow author, Monty Hayes McMillan, who co-wrote the Love Book with me. we have a whole chapter on civil society, and we talk about how the American myth has become the American nightmare. And this is, many people say this. Mm. America needs a new myth. And until that gets written, we're floundering, and we're not doing too well out there in many ways in the eyes of the rest of the world and domestically as well. So the reason we need new stories is humans are meaning-making creatures. We demand meaning. We see patterns. Sometimes we make them up when we can't quite figure them out. And so to get new stories, new mythologies that will help us make our way through these changes, a lot of which have been brought about by technology and science and that stranglehold that our old boring ways seem to have on us. We need new stories to get us out of the past and to help us move into the future in positive ways for as many people as possible. Because stories motivate people.
Absolutely. We need to do some kind of workshop wrangling where we really dig into world building. I'm thinking build that as part of the summit. Like maybe after we've got done with all the classes, we'll just get a whole group of people together and like talk world building and like utopian world building. Like how can we make this work? What principles can we fathom together to build something? This was the spark, the beginning of the new idea which led to the formation of the think tank, where we explored two core questions. What specifically do we need to do to eliminate violence and poverty and for people to have better lives? And then how do we weave these factors into the stories that we write, whether they're for the screen or for the page? You'll see in this next clip a brief sample of some of the tangible tipping points that we talked about. The folks on screen are Tom Shee, one of the think tank experts and founding member of Google X, and Rob Cowell, CEO of the Bottom Up Show.
So I can imagine, putting an elephant in orbit around Saturn. It's just not very useful. It is in fact physically possible. And I think actually a number of the things that we are imagining for our future, though they may not sound as absurd as that, are kind of as absurd as that because they are buying into ways of metabolizing the resources of the planet and ways of human beings interacting that won't have any longevity and will be incredibly expensive. So a grounding cord is basically the idea of something that brings you back into a clear-headed evaluation of the combinations, the permutations of imagination that are actually serviceful for humanity as opposed to just fanciful. And there are things that can be fanciful and serviceful, but the grounding cord is like, well, it just makes sure that it does something useful for us.
And that sounds like a big part of the job that Laura Lee has brought you in to do for this gig.
Yep.
You're the grounding cord.
Yeah, I think, so my first job was as an astrophysicist, and I think always physicists are pretty grounded, actually. I mean, they get a little heady around string theory and stuff. And,
oh, shush.
Oh, okay. I'm not supposed to.
You picked that one
say
out. That was my master's, so he's just teasing there. Go on.
That's true too, but it's okay. But other than that, like physicists are pretty, in it. They're pretty connected to, well, what would actually make sense and be possible.
Yeah. I think the other thing, sorry if I might add something in here, is the idea of thinking. So Tom talks about how if it were just about technology that was going to change the way that we live and maybe save us from all the suffering and starvation and so on that's happening on the planet, then we would have accomplished some of that through technology already. But one of the things that, do you remember the story that you tell about the being in the truck and talking to your friend about the thinking, and it's our thinking that has to evolve?
Yeah. So basically, a couple different ways to phrase it, but I guess the story you're alluding to is I was in a pickup truck in the cloud forest in Guatemala working with my friend who's the CEO of a company that's bringing electricity to these remote communities that have never had electricity ever. And, we're driving through the jungle and it takes a while to get anywhere because there really aren't roads, or that you would hardly call them roads. And we're kind of rumbling through, and we have maybe 5 hours before we arrive at the village. So we get to talking, and one of the things that my friend Juan says is, Tom, what if it's too late? Like, what if we just have too many people on Earth and it won't be possible for the Earth to be sustainable with this many people? Like, maybe we could make it if we had half as many people. And almost without thinking, I turned to him and I said, well, Juan, we had half as many people as we do today, like 40 years ago. And if we continue to think the way that we did then, and pretty much the same way that we do now, then even if we had half as many people, in 40 more years, we'd have all the same problems. The issue is not out there. The issue is in here somewhere. And another way that I phrase this idea is humanity always wields technology at the level of consciousness that it's currently operating at. And if you go back to the nuclear example, so like we split the atom, around the turn of the 20th century, and it is possible to go use that technology to basically make infinite, carbon neutral power that would allow the entire planet to be powered. But the consciousness around the turn of the century was the consciousness that was leading into World War I, World War II. So what we decided to do with that same technological capability, the discovery of nuclear power, was we decided to make an arsenal so powerful that we could blow up every person on Earth 3 times over. And it was just an expression of the consciousness that we were at. There was nothing about the physics that made it so that we had to make missiles and bombs instead of infinite, incredibly cheap power. Now, around the turn of the 21st century, we're in that zone as well. We've discovered a lot about silicon-based computing, communications, and so on. And our consciousness right now, it's not necessarily a world war consciousness. There is terrorism and all that sort of thing, and that's its own topic. But we have mostly a commerce-driven consciousness. And if you were to look at some of our biggest moves in artificial intelligence and some of our most advanced computer science research, what we actually use it for and where we put the most talented people in the world, the most talented computer scientists in the world right now are figuring out how to serve you ads. That's what a commerce consciousness does with a technology like digital technology. And a World War I consciousness takes something like splitting the atom and decides to make bombs. So I think that if an AI were to take over the Earth, it probably wouldn't destroy us. It would probably sell us a bunch of stuff we don't need.
For the panel selector, we'd like to discuss some of the important factors that we discovered in the think tank and share them with you so that you can go and create massive social change, harnessing the power of story. Here's another example from one of our proposed panelists, John Truby. In this clip, we start to talk about how to structure stories for maximum social impact. So John Truby has been studying story for over 40 years and teaching it for over 30. To say he's the granddaddy of story analysis is kind of an understatement. Now, over the years, his students have generated over 15 billion at the box office. And John is also one of our think tank experts. And you'll see why in a few minutes. John, so let's dive in.
Let's do it. Great.
Okay, so we've titled this interview The New Epic, and this idea of the new epic came out because we were talking about the story structures that best enable us to build a new world in real life. And we looked at a few different things like social drama, sci-fi and fantasy. Do you want to talk a little bit about these structures and the problems with them?
Yeah, in order to tell a story, especially a story of this scope, you have to use genres that have that kind of world-size scope built into them. Mm-hmm. And there are not very many that do that. One of them is social drama, another sci-fi, fantasy, myth. These are all very big picture forms. Mm. And they go at the problem of telling a story with worldwide implications in very different ways. Social drama deals directly with social issues like poverty, racism, violence, prejudice, and so on. And it shows a group of people dealing with this problem, and it plays it out in dramatic terms. So it's very realistic form. And it's a very focused form in the sense that it hones in typically on one special problem. Examples are Grapes of Wrath, Aaron Brockovich. And the power of it is that they are dealing with the often subconscious blocks and problems that people have deep down, things like racism and sexism and so on. Mm-hmm. And they bring them to the surface and they deal with them and they try to come up with some kind of a solution in the story. The problem with this way of approaching the problem is that it's so focused and so realistic that for anybody who is not part of that specific problem or doesn't think they're part of that problem, says, well, that's not my story. I'm not interested in that story. And typically these stories do not have a lot of popular appeal. So their effect is very limited. Now, occasionally you will break out of that. And Aaron Brockovich, very popular. A Grapes of Wrath, not just a very important social novel, but very popular, and it had a big effect. Mm. The other approach is to go very abstract, which is what myth, science fiction, and fantasy are. They are all about setting up a story world. And because they use these very strong fantasy elements and mythological elements, what you get is typically a character traveling through a fantastical world that is filled with a number of subworlds. And in these subworlds, this is where the writer typically expresses the social message they're trying to get across. Because what they do is they set up either dystopias or utopias, and they often put them into contrast. Classic example of this, extremely well done, is Lord of the Rings, where you have these subworlds like the Shire and Rivendell and so on. And then you also have this dystopian worlds that have to do with Mount Doom and so on. So what you get is this very strong visual distinction between story worlds. But these dystopians and utopias are by definition extremes. They're on either end of good versus evil. And so the problem is that the message that they get across these stories, while they can be very powerful and are typically quite popular, the message they get across is very simplistic. Mm-hmm. It really has, there's no moral shading going on at all. And there's no real getting into the cause of these problems in the society in any kind of depth or any kind of sophistication. So they can have dramatic power, but they don't have a lot of intellectual power. And so, the big challenge for writers, if they're trying to do a story for social profit, a story that can really change the world, is they've got to find really the strengths of both of those extreme forms. And that's where, really the only form that does that is the epic.
Right. Okay. So this is the alternative to these other three types of structure. Now, I use the term epic, kind of like a valley girl, I think you call it. So what is the technical definition of epic?
Well, epic goes all the way back, thousands of years. And it's a story form originally that was defined as the fate of the nation is determined by the actions of a single person or family. Now, over the years, that definition has broadened. It's a little bit looser now. And now you have epics where the fate of the nation is illustrated by the actions of a particular person or nation. And one of the reasons it's loosened up is that when we move from societies that are governed by kings and we move into a democracy, the old way of doing an epic has to change because we now have the everyman hero. He's not going to be a king. He's just going to be an average guy. And so that's why you're not necessarily going to have this average guy literally changing the nation by a few actions that he does. But the story that he goes through, and an example of this is The Godfather, the story that he goes through illustrates a larger national journey. And it gives you a picture, an image of that nation. In the case of Godfather, a very negative image of the nation.
Right, and then you can have things like House of Cards, I guess, where you do have a king, a literal king.
Well, that's inherent to the theme of House of Cards, and it's a great point because the whole concept of House of Cards, which of course came over from the British show, but the whole point of House of Cards is this is a guy who is supposed to be in the highest levels of a democratic government, who is acting more and more like a king, and therefore he is corrupt. And in fact, over the course of that series, we have the classic story movement that we got in old epics and Shakespearean dramas of the rise and fall of a king. But really, House of Cards is just one of a number of examples of television epics. And epic really has found its greatest voice in the television medium. And there are a number of reasons for that, but the main one is that the television is really where the finest writing is being done in worldwide storytelling today. And it's specifically being done on these serial TV dramas. And one of the features of these serial TV dramas is that we have these multiple characters. We have more characters in these stories than any other story form, with the possible exception of video games. But the point is, we're dealing with multiple characters. So in these stories, we're really tracking a mini society as it goes over the course of one season or multiple seasons. So it's perfect for the epic form, and it gives television the advantage that film doesn't have. Film, even an epic film, is going to be maybe 2.5 hours. On rare occasion, a little bit more than that. But you're talking about a 2.5 hour canvas. Whereas TV now, which we used to think is the little box, compared to the big screen, with TV now, we can have an entire season, 10, 12 or more episodes per season, and then multiple seasons that we can track the scope of the story, but then also get the advantage that epic gives us over those other story forms I mentioned, which is you can get into complexity, you can get into the sophistication, and you can get into the shadings of the moral problems that we face as a society and as a world that film cannot do.
But the story form and format you use is only part of what you need to consider. Have a listen to these two titans share some of their thoughts on how to tell a great story. The first one is Michael Anderle. He's the third of our proposed panelists and is consistently a top 100 author in Amazon with his Catherian Gambit series.
And then somewhere around book 4, I'm listening to a podcast that says you should have multiple entry points. And I'm like, well, I don't have that. And then by then, the fans are getting up, and my 13-part series is 21 books. And I'm like, wow, okay, entry point. Well, I've got 3 major arcs, and kind of tying this into the chaperone comment, open loops. The item that you've seen or that you've read is you should not have cliffhangers. How many people believe you should put a cliffhanger in your book? Okay, and the reason for doing it is
get them to the next book.
Get them to the next book, right? And what's the argument for not doing it? Piss them off, right? All right. So Matt and I had like a half an hour argument on on the definition of a cliffhanger. In fact, we were at Wikipedia yesterday going, this is what Wikipedia says about a cliffhanger, motherfucker. And so what we came up with was we couldn't agree. And so my definition of a cliffhanger is someone is hanging on the side of a cliff and about to die, and you end the book. And that upsets people, right? So is that everyone's general concept of a cliff? Yes, yes, yes. Yes, everyone do this and then point at Matt. Okay, so Matt, what is your... Okay, Paula, what's your definition of a cliffhanger?
I have so satisfactorily wrote a story, and I have ended this story in its natural conclusion that you want to follow a character I've created in this book that goes to the next one.
Okay, but that... It's like a teaser, right? No, but that's not a teaser. You finished it. You just want to be with the...
This particular story has reached its natural conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a continuing element to the story
yes.
and the characters that I must find out what happens to the rest of the characters.
Okay, so you're in the Matt camp of what a cliffhanger is. I would tend to think it's a teaser, not a definition of a cliffhanger. 77-2. We win. All right, so one of the things that I do in my books is, and that I loved, is I will open up a story, a minor thing. Here's an example. 3 of my characters, Team BMW, which is Bobcat, Marcus, and William, 2 guys from the military and a rocket scientist, have decided to open up a bar in space. They're going to call it All Guns Blazing. They have been working on this bar 2 books. They still haven't finished it. But you get more and more invested in the concept of them opening this bar. And it's minor. No one's going to die. Probably not. You know, it's space. It could happen. But no one's going to do it. But there are so many of these. And so tying it to the Andre comment, he talked about open loops. A person's brain, when they know that there's a start of something, they want to know what it finishes. They need to know that it closes. So my question when I was talking to him, trying to figure out, why are my books, why are they going through? I'm very intuitive when I write. I'm intuitive because I've been reading my whole life, and I've never gone through any classes past high school. So, well, okay, college, but let's not discuss that part. So he said, you know, what's going on is if you open enough minor loops, it's going to have a resonance, and people are going to keep needing to know. And you tack that on with engaged characters that they want to visit again, and you've got them. You got them right where you want them, which is avid fans who want to be with you the next time. I literally have people going, your books are like cocaine, I hate you, when is the next book out? And I'm like, motherfucker, Thursday was the last one.
Amazing. And what about like story world? Like rather than focusing on the character, right, looking at the story world as a way of showing how we could live together collectively, you know, without the anger, or transcending the anger and the problems and, you know, the human condition almost.
Right. You know, I think that just in terms of the human condition, that's a story when it's going really well is taking on an angle. You know, this just takes on an angle of the human condition. I watched Paradise Now a couple days ago. I had never seen that. I watched that, and there's when you can be transported into a world and see someone else's point of view. You know, that Paradise Now is a film that, you know, that it takes us into the lives of a suicide bomber. But the story is told where the protagonist is a potential suicide bomber. So being taken into that world and hearing that story in a way, it absolutely humanizes and opens us up to be able to, at a minimum, see the others as human beings. Right. So to me, at its best, that is the value of story in aiding in the human condition. A movie or a story can't really do it. It can't, you know, do the work. It just opens up dialogue. It opens up conversation in a way that there's very few other things that can assist human beings in connecting the way a great story can.
And that's what we'd love to do with this panel. open a conversation on how we can use the power of story to change the world. Here are some of the questions that we'd like to pose. What are the best story strategies and techniques for creatives to affect social change? How do you take your ideas and weave them into effective stories that will not just change minds, but also be entertaining and popular? And then how do you express human consciousness in a story that shows both its limitations and the ways that we can change it for the better? Okay, so hopefully this gives you an idea of what we're shooting for. And if this is resonating with you on any level, then please do go ahead and vote to see this panel at the conference. And feel free to look at some of the videos and the notes on the resource page that we're sharing in the links attached to this application. And if you like what you see and you want to hear more from John Truby, Pamela J. Smith, Michael Anderley, and myself, Laura Lee Clark, at the conference, then hit vote for Shifting Consciousness and the World Through Story. Thank you for watching.